Security! Get this beggar out. She's not invited. My son's bride screamed during my grandson's birthday party. I only smiled and said, I came to bring a special guest who wanted to see you. When she saw who was behind me, panic! I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I clutched the small gift bag containing Tommy's birthday present as I walked through the entrance of Riverside Country Club. At 66 years old, I had learned to dress carefully for family events. My navy blue dress was 3 years old but clean and pressed. My shoes were comfortable flats from a discount store, but they were polished. I might not have much money, but I refused to look like I didn't care. The hostess at the front desk looked me up and down with barely concealed judgment. Her nameplate read Ashley, and her smile was as fake as her eyelashes. Are you here for a reservation? She asked, her tone suggesting I had wandered into the wrong place. I'm here for the Whitmore birthday party, I said, keeping my voice steady. For Tommy. I'm his grandmother. She checked her tablet twice, frowning. I don't see your name on the list. My stomach tightened. Of course Ophelia hadn't put me on the list. There must be some mistake. It's my grandson's 5th birthday. Ashley's expression softened slightly, more from pity than understanding. Let me call the party planner. She spoke in hushed tones to someone on the phone while I stood there feeling smaller by the minute. Other guests walked past me toward the ballroom, all dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. You can go in, Ashley finally said. But please check with Mrs. Whitmore when you arrive. The ballroom took my breath away, but not in a good way. Everything screamed money. Massive balloon arrangements in red and blue covered every surface. A professional photographer moved through the crowd. The cake looked like it belonged in a magazine. 3 tiers decorated with handcrafted superhero figures that probably cost more than I spent on food in a month. I spotted Tommy immediately. He was wearing a custom Spider-Man costume that looked like it came straight from a movie set. He was surrounded by children I didn't recognize, all in expensive costumes of their own. When was the last time I had seen him? It had been over 2 months, maybe 3. Every time I called to arrange a visit, Ophelia had an excuse. Grandma Janine! Tommy's face lit up when he saw me. He broke away from his group and ran toward me with his arms wide. My heart filled as I knelt down to catch him in a hug. He smelled like expensive soap and hair gel, not like the little boy who used to play in my apartment and eat peanut butter sandwiches at my kitchen table. Happy birthday, sweetheart, I whispered into his hair. You're getting so big. Did you bring me a present? He asked with pure 5-year-old excitement. I handed him the small gift bag. Inside was a wooden train I had found at a thrift store and spent hours cleaning and repainting. It wasn't much compared to the mountain of expensive gifts I could see piled on a table across the room, but it was made with love. Tommy pulled out the train and his eyes went wide. It's so cool. Look, it has real wheels. He started pushing it along the floor, making train sounds, completely absorbed in this simple toy while surrounded by hundreds of dollars worth of electronic gadgets and designer clothes. Tommy, darling, come show your friends your other presents, came a voice that made my blood run cold. Ophelia approached us like a queen holding court. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves that probably took hours to achieve. Her dress was designer, her jewelry was real, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Everything about her screamed wealth and status, 2 things I had never been able to provide for my son after his father died when Miles was only 12. Mommy, look what Grandma Janine gave me. Tommy held up his wooden train proudly. Ophelia's smile faltered for just a moment as she looked at the simple toy, then snapped back into place. How lovely. Why don't you go play with Jacob and Emma? They're waiting for you by the bounce house. Tommy ran off, still clutching his train, leaving me alone with my daughter-in-law. The woman who had spent the last 3 years systematically removing me from my family's life. Janine, she said, not bothering to hide the ice in her voice. What a surprise to see you here. It's my grandson's birthday, I replied, fighting to keep my voice calm. Of course I'm here. Well, that's just it. Ophelia said, tilting her head with false sympathy. This is really more of an intimate gathering, close family and immediate friends. I looked around the ballroom. There had to be 60 people here, most of whom I had never seen before. I am close family. I'm Tommy's grandmother. Her laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, Janine, you know what I mean. We've moved into a different social circle now. People have certain expectations. Before I could ask what that was supposed to mean, I heard my son's voice behind me. Mom, I didn't know you were coming. I turned to see Miles walking toward us, and my heart broke a little more. This wasn't the boy I had raised working 2 jobs to keep us afloat after his father died. This wasn't the son who used to call me every day and bring me flowers on Mother's Day. This was a stranger wearing expensive clothes and looking at me like I was an embarrassment. I wouldn't miss Tommy's birthday, I said simply. Miles glanced nervously at Ophelia, who moved closer to him and placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked loving but felt possessive. Well, you probably should have called first, he said, not meeting my eyes. Ophelia put a lot of work into planning this. I'm sure she did. I looked around at the elaborate decorations again. How much did all this cost? Mom, Miles said, his voice carrying a warning. I'm just asking. Tommy is 5 years old. Does he really need all this? Ophelia stepped forward, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. I think what's important is giving children the best we can provide. Some people believe in making sacrifices for family. The implication was clear. I was the selfish one, the grandmother who didn't love her grandson enough to provide expensive parties and designer clothes. Miles, she continued, why don't you show your mother the dessert table? I need to check on the entertainment. But she didn't move. She wanted to watch whatever was about to happen. My son shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe it would be better if you didn't stay too long. This really isn't. Isn't what? I asked. He struggled to find the words, and I could see Ophelia's influence in his hesitation. It's just that these people, they're important for my career. Ophelia's father has connections, and I need to make a good impression. And having your mother here would hurt that impression? The silence stretched between us while conversations continued around us. I could feel eyes starting to turn our way, could sense the whispered conversations beginning. That's when Ophelia made her move. She had been waiting for this moment, I realized. She had planned this humiliation. You know what? She said, raising her voice so it carried across the nearby tables. I think there's been a misunderstanding. She turned to the security guard who had been stationed near the entrance. Excuse me, could you help us with a situation? My stomach dropped as the uniformed man approached. Around us, conversations began to quiet. This woman seems to be confused about the guest list, Ophelia announced, her voice projecting across the ballroom. She's not actually invited to this private event. The security guard looked uncomfortable but approached me anyway. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Every conversation in the room stopped. Every eye turned to watch the 66-year-old woman being escorted out of her grandson's birthday party like some kind of criminal. I stood there, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, feeling smaller than I had in years. My own daughter-in-law had just publicly humiliated me, and my son was standing there saying nothing, not defending me, not correcting her, not even looking at me. But then something changed inside me. A calm settled over my shoulders like a warm shawl. I had been quiet for too long. I had accepted too many insults, made too many excuses for their behavior, convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. I looked directly at Ophelia and smiled. I saw her confidence waver slightly. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, before I go, I should mention that I brought someone with me today, a special guest who's been very eager to meet you, Ophelia. Her face went pale. What are you talking about? He's waiting outside. I thought it might be nice for him to join the celebration. I paused, watching her reaction carefully. Especially since he has such a personal interest in your current condition. Miles frowned. Mom, what guest? You came alone? I pulled out my phone and held it up, my finger hovering over a contact. Someone who's been dying to congratulate you on your happy news, Ophelia. I think you two have a lot to catch up on. The color drained completely from her face. Her hand went instinctively to her slightly rounded belly, barely visible under her carefully chosen dress. She was 3 months pregnant, and only the immediate family was supposed to know. "Who is it?" she demanded, but I could hear her voice shaking now. "Just someone who cares about you very much," I said sweetly. "Someone who's been wondering how you've been doing lately." Ophelia looked like she was about to be sick. For the first time in 3 years, I was the one with power in this relationship. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," she whispered. "No game," I replied, just the truth finally coming to light. I hit the call button and put the phone to my ear. When the person answered, I said simply, "David?" "Yes, she's here. Come on in." The panic in Ophelia's eyes was absolute and complete. The ballroom held its breath as I ended the call. Ophelia stood frozen, her face drained of all color, while Miles looked between us with growing confusion. The security guard hesitated, unsure whether he should still escort me out or wait to see what would happen next. "Who is David?" Miles asked, his voice cutting through the tension. I looked at my son, this man I had raised alone after his father's sudden heart attack, and felt a mixture of love and disappointment. When had he become so willing to let someone else control his life? "That's an excellent question," I said calmly. Perhaps Ophelia would like to answer it, but Ophelia seemed incapable of speech. She stood there trembling, one hand pressed to her throat, the other resting protectively over her belly. I had been planning this moment for 3 weeks, ever since I discovered the truth about my daughter-in-law's secret life. But to understand how I got to this point, you need to know how systematically Ophelia had worked to erase me from my family. It started small, the way these things always do. Little comments here and there about how different our backgrounds were, how Miles deserved to move up in the world, how some people were stuck in old ways of thinking. The first major blow came during their engagement. I had been planning Miles's bachelor party the way I had always imagined I would when he got married. Nothing fancy, just dinner at his favorite restaurant and maybe a baseball game, the same way his father and I had celebrated with our friends 35 years ago. But when I mentioned my plans to Ophelia, she laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Janine, that's so sweet," she had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But Miles's groomsmen are expecting something a bit more sophisticated. We've already booked a weekend in Vegas." "We?" I had asked. "Well, I helped plan it. You understand, don't you? These are important business relationships for Miles. He needs to make the right impression." I should have fought harder then. I should have insisted that a mother had the right to celebrate her son's upcoming marriage. Instead, I convinced myself that compromise was better than conflict. The wedding was worse. Ophelia's family paid for everything, which meant they controlled everything. I was allowed to invite 12 people to a 300-person celebration. I was seated at a table in the back with distant relatives I barely knew. My speech was cut from the program because they were running long. During the reception, I watched my son dance with his new wife, surrounded by her family and friends, and realized I was already becoming a stranger in his life. The exclusion became more systematic after they married. Holiday traditions that Miles and I had shared for 24 years were suddenly replaced with Ophelia's family customs. The small apartment where I had raised him became an embarrassment to be hidden from their new social circle. "It's not personal, Mom," Miles would say when I questioned why I was never invited to dinner parties or work events. "It's just that Ophelia's friends are. Well, they're used to a certain lifestyle." What he meant was that I was too poor, too working class, too much of a reminder of where he came from. Ophelia had convinced him that moving up in the world meant leaving his past behind, and I was part of that past. The worst incident happened 18 months ago. I had been battling a particularly bad case of bronchitis and ended up in the emergency room one night when I couldn't stop coughing. The doctor wanted to keep me for observation, and I was scared and alone. I called Miles at 11 o'clock that night. "Mom, is everything okay?" He sounded genuinely concerned. "I'm at St. Mary's Hospital," I managed to say between coughing fits. "The doctor thinks I might have pneumonia." "Oh God, I'll be right there." But he never came. An hour later, he called back. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Ophelia reminded me that we have that presentation tomorrow morning for her father's company. It's really important for my career. Can you call me in the morning and let me know how you're doing? I spent that night alone in a hospital bed, listening to machines beep and watching nurses care for strangers, while my son chose a business presentation over his sick mother. When I was discharged the next day, I found a bouquet of flowers on my doorstep with a card. Sorry I couldn't be there. Love, Miles and Ophelia. She had probably picked them out and signed his name. That's when I started paying closer attention to the changes in my son. The way he had stopped calling unless I called first, how he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder when we talked, as if Ophelia might be listening. The way he made excuses for everything she did, even when her behavior was clearly wrong. I watched her isolate him from his old friends too. Guys he had known since college suddenly became immature or not ambitious enough. His hobbies were replaced with activities that fit Ophelia's image of what a successful couple should do. Wine tastings instead of baseball games, gallery openings instead of poker nights. The final piece of evidence I needed came 3 weeks ago, completely by accident. I had been walking home from the grocery store when I saw them. Ophelia and a man I didn't recognize, sitting in a corner booth at a small cafe downtown. They were holding hands across the table, and she was laughing in a way I had never seen her laugh with Miles. I should have kept walking. Any normal person would have minded their own business. But something about the intimacy of their body language, the way she kept touching his face, made me stop and watch. They kissed. Not a friendly peck, but the kind of passionate kiss you see between lovers. And when they pulled apart, I saw her place his hand on her belly in a gesture that made my blood run cold. I followed them at a distance when they left the cafe. They walked to a small apartment building 6 blocks away, and she used her own key to let them in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that gesture, about the timeline, about the way Ophelia had announced her pregnancy on social media without even telling me first. The next day, I did something I had never done before in my life. I hired a private investigator. His name was Robert Chen, and he was recommended by a neighbor whose husband had hired him during their divorce. Robert was professional, discreet, and surprisingly affordable. I need to know about my daughter-in-law's activities, I told him during our meeting in his small office. I think she might be having an affair. Robert took notes while I described what I had seen. How long do you want me to follow her? However long it takes to get the truth. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of photographs, of documented meetings, of evidence that painted a picture I had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Ophelia had been seeing David Morrison for 8 months. He was a real estate agent, divorced, no children. They met twice a week at his apartment. She had told him she was separated from her husband and planning to file for divorce. The most damaging evidence was a recording Robert had made when Ophelia and David were having coffee in a public place. Their conversation was devastating. "When are you going to tell your husband?" David had asked. "Soon," Ophelia had replied. "I just need to make sure the timing is right. Miles has some business opportunities coming up through my father's connections. Once those are secured, I can leave him and we can start our life together. And the baby will be raised by its real father," she had said, reaching across to squeeze David's hand. Robert's final report included bank records showing that Ophelia had been using Miles's credit cards to pay for hotel rooms and expensive gifts for David. She had been financing her affair with my son's money while planning to leave him and take half his assets in the divorce. Now, standing in that ballroom with the truth burning in my chest, I watched Ophelia struggle to find words that might save her from the disaster she had created. "Mom," Miles said, his voice strained. "What's going on? Who is David?" Before I could answer, the ballroom doors opened and David Morrison walked in. He was tall, handsome in a generic way, and looked completely confused about why he had been summoned to a children's birthday party. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Ophelia, and I watched his face cycle through recognition, confusion, and growing alarm as he took in the scene. "Ophelia?" he called out, starting toward her. "What's going on? You said you had something important to tell me." Miles turned to look at the stranger approaching his wife, and I saw the exact moment when pieces began clicking into place in his mind. "Who is this man?" Miles asked again, but this time his voice was deadly quiet. David reached our small group and looked between Miles and Ophelia with growing understanding. "Wait," he said slowly. "Are you the husband?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Ophelia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in the 3 years I had known her, she had no quick lie, no smooth explanation, no way to manipulate her way out of the truth. "Answer him," I said quietly. "Tell David who Miles is. Tell Miles who David is." The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and I realized that after 3 years of being powerless in my own family, I finally held all the cards. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Every guest within earshot had stopped their conversations to watch the drama unfolding near the entrance. David Morrison stood there looking bewildered. Miles was pale with growing understanding, and Ophelia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "I asked you a question," David said, his voice louder now. "Is this your husband?" Ophelia's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. The confident woman who had been ordering security to remove me just minutes earlier had completely lost her composure. "Yes," Miles said finally, his voice hollow. "I'm her husband. And you are?" David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then pure anger. "Her husband? But she told me. She said she was separated. She said she was getting divorced." I watched my son absorb this information, saw the way his shoulders straightened as the implications hit him. Around us, the party guests were no longer pretending not to listen. Several people had pulled out their phones. "Divorced?" Miles repeated slowly. "We're not getting divorced. We're having a baby." The words hit David like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face draining of color. "A baby? But we." He turned to stare at Ophelia, who had begun trembling visibly. "Ophelia," Miles said, and there was something dangerous in his quiet tone. "I think you need to explain what's going on here." But I could see she was beyond explanation. The careful web of lies she had constructed was unraveling faster than she could rebuild it. So I decided to help move things along. "Perhaps I should explain," I said, pulling out my phone, since Ophelia seems to have lost her voice. I scrolled to the folder where I had saved Robert's report and selected the first photograph. It showed Ophelia and David kissing outside his apartment building, her hand clearly visible on his chest, both of them obviously intimate and comfortable with each other. "This was taken 2 weeks ago," I said, holding the phone so both men could see the screen. Miles stared at the image, his face going through its own transformation. Hurt, betrayal, anger, all of it cycling through his features as he processed what he was seeing. David grabbed the phone from my hands, scrolling through the other photos Robert had taken. There were dozens of them, Ophelia entering David's apartment, the two of them having coffee, shopping together, kissing in his car. 8 months, David whispered, looking at the timestamps. "She's been lying to me for 8 months. "She's been lying to all of us," I said gently. Miles finally found his voice. "How long?" he asked, staring at his wife. "How long has this been going on?" Ophelia tried to speak, but only managed a broken sob. "Since February," I answered for her. "They met at a coffee shop downtown. She told him she was separated and planning to divorce you as soon as some business opportunities came through." David's face twisted with disgust. "Business opportunities? You mean she was using me while she waited to cash in on your success?" The crowd around us had grown larger. Tommy ran over at one point, tugging on his father's jacket, but Miles was so focused on the revelation that he barely noticed. One of Ophelia's friends quickly distracted the boy and led him away. "There's more," I said, pulling up the audio file Robert had recorded. "No," Ophelia finally spoke, her voice cracked and desperate. "Please don't." But I hit play anyway. Her voice came through clearly. "Miles has some business opportunities coming up through my father's connections. Once those are secured, I can leave him, and we can start our life together." The words hung in the air like poison. Miles actually stepped backward, as if the sound of his wife planning to leave him was a physical assault. "And the baby?" David's recorded voice asked. "Will be raised by its real father," came Ophelia's response. That's when Miles broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet devastation of a man whose entire world had just collapsed. He sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. David whirled on Ophelia, his face flushed with rage. "Real father? Are you telling me this baby might be mine?" Ophelia was crying now, ugly sobs that smeared her perfect makeup. "I don't know," she whispered. "The timing. It could be either of you." The admission hit both men like separate lightning strikes. Miles looked up from his hands, his eyes hollow. David stood frozen, processing the fact that he might be unknowingly fathering another man's child while that man raised the baby believing it was his own. "Either of us?" David's voice rose to near shouting. "You've been sleeping with both of us and you don't know whose baby you're carrying?" Several guests gasped audibly. The professional photographer, who had been documenting Tommy's party, looked unsure whether to keep taking pictures of what was turning into a family disaster. "It's not what you think," Ophelia pleaded, reaching toward both men. "I love you both, just in different ways." "You love us?" David laughed bitterly. "You've been lying to me about everything. Your name, your situation, your availability. I don't even know who you really are." Miles stood up slowly, his movements careful and controlled. "Neither do I," he said quietly. That's when I realized I needed to share the most damaging evidence of all. I scrolled to the bank records Robert had obtained through legal channels during his investigation. "There's something else you both need to see," I said. The records showed months of credit card charges that told the whole story. Hotel rooms charged to Miles's account where Ophelia had met David. Expensive gifts purchased for David using Miles's money. Restaurant bills, theater tickets, even a weekend trip to the mountains, all of it paid for by my son while his wife carried on an affair. "She's been financing her relationship with you using my money," Miles said to David, his voice eerily calm. David looked sick. "I never knew. She always insisted on paying when we went out. I thought she had her own money." "She does," Miles said. "Mine." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 8 months of documented deception, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse. Ophelia had been playing both men against each other while planning to abandon whichever one served her purposes less effectively. But even faced with absolute proof of her betrayal, she tried one more manipulation. "Miles," she said, moving toward him with her hands outstretched, "we can work through this. I made mistakes, but I choose you. I want to stay married. We can go to counseling." My son looked at her with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but complete disgust. "You choose me?" he repeated. "After 8 months of lying, cheating, and stealing from me? You think you get to choose?" "People make mistakes in marriage," she said desperately. "This doesn't have to end everything." David let out a harsh laugh. "Mistakes? You told me you loved me. You let me believe we were building a future together. You let me believe this baby was mine." "It still might be," she said quietly. The admission seemed to break something in both men. Miles sat back down heavily, while David began pacing like a caged animal. "I need a paternity test," David said finally. "If this baby is mine, I want to know." "And if it is?" Miles asked. "Then I'll take responsibility for it." "But I want nothing to do with her." David pointed at Ophelia like she was something contaminated. "This woman is poison." Ophelia's face crumpled. "You can't mean that. Both of you. We're a family." "No," I said firmly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "Families are built on truth and love and respect. What you built was a house of cards, and now it's falling down." She turned to me with sudden viciousness. "This is all your fault. You couldn't stand seeing Miles happy, so you destroyed our marriage out of spite." The accusation was so absurd that several people in the crowd actually laughed. After everything that had been revealed, she was still trying to make herself the victim. "I didn't destroy your marriage, Ophelia," I said calmly. "You did that all by yourself." Miles stood up again, and when he looked at his wife, there was finality in his expression. "We're done," he said simply. "Miles, please." "We're done," he repeated, louder this time. "Whatever we had, whatever I thought we had, it's over." Ophelia looked around the room wildly, searching for someone, anyone who might support her, but the guests were all staring at her with combinations of shock, disgust, and pity. Even her own friends were backing away, unwilling to be associated with the spectacle she had created. That's when she made her final, desperate play. She grabbed David's arm with both hands, clinging to him like he was a life preserver. "David, please. You said you loved me. You said you wanted to build a life with me. That can still happen. We can still have that." He looked down at her hands on his arm like they were diseased. "You're right," he said slowly. "I did love you. I loved someone who doesn't exist. Someone who was honest and available and real. But that person was just another one of your lies." He pulled his arm free and stepped away from her. "I never want to see you again." Ophelia stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making. The perfect party she had planned, the perfect image she had cultivated, the perfect life she had manipulated her way into. All of it was crumbling around her. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe again. The ballroom had become a theater of public humiliation, and Ophelia was center stage in a performance she had never intended to give. Around us, party guests whispered behind raised hands, their children forgotten as they witnessed the spectacular collapse of what they had thought was a perfect marriage. But Ophelia wasn't finished fighting. I could see the calculation in her eyes, even through her tears as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. When manipulation failed, she had always turned to melodrama, and true to form, she doubled down on victimhood. "You're all enjoying this, aren't you?" she said, her voice rising as she spun around to address the watching crowd. "You're all so perfect, so above reproach, that you can stand there judging me." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few began gathering their children and heading toward the exits, unwilling to be part of whatever was coming next. "Ophelia, stop," Miles said quietly. "You're making this worse." "Worse?" She let out a hysterical laugh. "How could this possibly be worse? My husband's mother has destroyed my marriage, my reputation, my entire life, and you're telling me not to make it worse?" "Your mother-in-law didn't make you have an affair," David said coldly. "She didn't make you lie to me for 8 months. She didn't make you steal money from your husband to pay for our dates." "I never stole anything," Ophelia snapped. I pulled out my phone again and scrolled to the credit card statements Robert had obtained. The Marriott Hotel, downtown, March 15th through 17th. $347 charged to Miles's Visa card. "The same weekend you told him you were visiting your sick aunt in Portland." Miles's face went white. "You told me your aunt died that weekend. You said you needed time alone to grieve." "She did die," Ophelia said weakly. "According to this hotel receipt, you were grieving with David in a king-size bed with room service," I continued, reading from the statement. "Champagne, strawberries, and massage oil charged to room service, all on Miles's credit card." The specificity of the details hit like hammer blows. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about calculated deception, about using my son's grief and trust to finance her betrayal. "The jewelry store on 5th Street," I read from another statement. April 22nd. $896 for a gold bracelet. "David, are you wearing anything gold?" David looked down at his wrist, where an expensive-looking gold chain bracelet caught the light. His face flushed as he realized what he was seeing. "You bought this for me with his money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a gift," Ophelia protested. "Couples buy each other gifts." "With money stolen from her husband," I added. Miles was reading over my shoulder now, seeing the full extent of his wife's financial betrayal. The weekend in wine country, the cooking classes, the couple's massage package. His voice broke slightly. "You did all the things with him that you said you were too busy to do with me." "Miles, I can explain." "No." The word came out sharp and final. "I don't want explanations. I want you to stop talking. But Ophelia had passed the point of rational behavior. The complete collapse of her carefully constructed world had pushed her into desperation, and desperate people do unpredictable things. "Fine," she screamed. "You want the truth? I'll give you the truth." She whirled around to face the remaining guests, her makeup streaked, her perfect hair disheveled, her designer dress wrinkled from her frantic movements. "I never loved him," she announced to the room. "I married Miles because he was safe, because he was grateful, because he would do whatever I wanted without questioning me." The words hit Miles like physical blows. I watched my son's face cycle through hurt, anger, and something that looked almost like relief. "You want to know why I had an affair?" Ophelia continued, beyond caring about the damage she was inflicting. "Because David made me feel alive. Because he was passionate and exciting and everything Miles could never be." "Then why didn't you just leave?" David asked, his voice disgusted. "Why drag this out for 8 months? "Because I needed time," she snapped. "Miles has connections through my father's business. There were opportunities coming up that would have set us up financially. I was going to leave him after those deals went through." The admission of her calculated planning sent another wave of shock through the room. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. It was a long-term strategy to use my son for financial gain while building a life with another man. "So you never intended to stay married to me," Miles said. It wasn't a question. "Not once I found something better," she replied, her honesty brutal in its simplicity. David stared at her in horror. "And what about me? Was I just a placeholder until you found something even better than what I could offer?" For the first time, Ophelia seemed to realize she had gone too far. "No, David, that's not. I love you. I chose you." "You chose me over a man you were planning to leave anyway. That's not choosing. That's settling for second best." The truth of his words seemed to hit her like a slap. She had been so focused on maintaining control of both relationships that she had never considered how her strategy looked from the outside. "All this time," Miles said slowly, "every time you criticized my clothes, my friends, my mother, you were comparing me to him. Miles, that's not... Every time you said I needed to be more ambitious, more sophisticated, more worthy of you, you were thinking about him." The accuracy of his assessment was written all over her face. She had spent 3 years trying to turn Miles into David while planning to leave him for the original. "You made me feel like I was never good enough," Miles continued, his voice growing stronger. "You made me question everything about myself, doubt every decision I made. You isolated me from my friends, my family, my own mother, because they reminded you of who I really was instead of who you wanted me to become. I was trying to help you reach your potential," she said desperately. "No," I interjected. "You were trying to make him into someone else entirely. Someone who would be worthy of staying with, even though you were planning to leave him anyway." The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Ophelia had been punishing Miles for not being David while secretly being with David, and planning to abandon Miles once he had served his financial purpose. "And the baby?" David asked quietly. "Our baby? What was your plan for that?" Ophelia's hand went to her stomach protectively. "I was going to tell you it was yours. We were going to raise it together. While Miles paid child support for a baby that wasn't his." The silence that followed was deafening. The moral implications of her plan were staggering. She had been prepared to let my son support another man's child, while that man raised the baby believing it was his own. "You're sick," David said finally. "You're genuinely, truly sick." "I'm pregnant!" she cried, as if that justified everything. "I'm carrying your child." "Maybe," he replied coldly. "And if I am the father, I'll take responsibility for the baby. But I want nothing to do with you. Nothing." Miles stood up from his chair, his movements careful and controlled. "I'm taking Tommy and going home," he announced. "Ophelia, I want you out of the house by tomorrow night. You can't throw me out. I live there too." "You live in a house I bought, furnished with furniture I paid for, while planning to leave me for another man and steal my money to finance your affair. Yes, I absolutely can throw you out." The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. Without Miles's financial support, without David's romantic support, she had nothing. Her elaborate lifestyle, her social position, her carefully curated image, all of it depended on the relationships she had just destroyed. "Miles, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling. I'll end things with David. I'll do whatever you want." "What I want," Miles said quietly, "is for you to disappear from my life completely." He turned and walked toward the party area where Tommy was playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. I watched my son gather his child with gentle hands, whispering something in the boy's ear that made him nod and smile. As they headed toward the exit, Miles paused next to me. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. A big one." "We'll talk later," I said softly. "Take care of Tommy first." He nodded and continued toward the door with his son. As they left, I noticed that Tommy was still clutching the wooden train I had given him, choosing my simple gift over all the expensive toys scattered around the ballroom. David was gathering his own things to leave, his face a mask of disgust and disappointment. "If the baby is mine," he said to Ophelia without looking at her, "my lawyer will be in touch about custody arrangements, but don't ever contact me directly again." And then he was gone too, leaving Ophelia alone in the center of the ballroom she had decorated so perfectly, surrounded by the ruins of the life she had built on lies. The remaining guests were filing out quickly now, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene, and probably already planning how they would tell this story to their friends. The photographer had stopped taking pictures. The caterers were beginning to clean up the untouched food. Ophelia stood there in her expensive dress, her belly barely showing the pregnancy that had become the center of a paternity dispute, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. "This isn't over," she said to me, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, but the kind of pity you feel for someone who has destroyed their own life through greed and selfishness. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "It's completely over." And as I walked out of that ballroom, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices, I knew I was right. The days following Tommy's birthday party felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. I had expected some fallout from exposing Ophelia's lies, but I hadn't anticipated how completely her world would unravel once the truth was out. Miles called me the morning after the party. His voice sounded hollow, exhausted. "Mom, can I come over? I need to talk to someone and I don't know who else to trust anymore." "Of course, sweetheart. Bring Tommy if you want. He's at my neighbor's house. I didn't want him to see me like this." When Miles arrived at my apartment an hour later, he looked like he had aged 5 years overnight. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled, and he moved like a man carrying an enormous weight. "I asked her to leave last night," he said without preamble, sinking into my old couch. "She's staying at her parents' house." I made coffee while he sat in silence, staring at his hands. When I brought him a cup, he looked up at me with an expression that broke my heart. "How long did you know?" he asked. I sat down across from him, choosing my words carefully. I suspected something was wrong for months, but I only had proof for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me?" I asked gently. He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. I would have thought you were just jealous of her, trying to cause problems. That's why I had to wait. I needed evidence you couldn't dismiss." Miles leaned back against the couch cushions, closing his eyes. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed. All the times she was distant, or secretive, or just not present, even when she was sitting right next to me. She was very good at manipulation, Miles. That's not your fault, isn't it?" He opened his eyes and looked at me. "I chose her over you. Over and over again, I chose her. When she didn't want you at holidays, when she made excuses for why you couldn't babysit Tommy, when she said you were too set in your ways to understand our new lifestyle. I went along with all of it." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate. I wanted to comfort him, but I also knew he needed to face the reality of what had happened between us. You were being manipulated by someone who made it her business to understand your weaknesses, I said. But yes, it hurt. It hurt more than I can tell you. I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know how to make up for the time we lost. We start from where we are now, I said simply. We don't waste any more time on regret. Over the following weeks, I watched Miles begin the difficult process of rebuilding his life. The divorce proceedings moved quickly once Ophelia realized she had no leverage. The paternity test results came back after 6 weeks. David was indeed the father of the baby she was carrying. The revelation hit Miles harder than I expected. Even though he had known it was a possibility, having it confirmed seemed to crystallize the depth of Ophelia's betrayal. She was going to let me raise another man's child, he said during one of our weekly dinners. She was going to let me love that baby, support it, be its father, while knowing the whole time that it wasn't mine. And she was going to let David believe he had abandoned his own child, I added. She was willing to hurt everyone involved to maintain her lie. Tommy was adjusting better than any of us had expected. At 5 years old, he didn't fully understand why Mommy had moved away, but he seemed to thrive with the increased attention from his father and the regular presence of his grandmother in his life again. Daddy, he said one evening while we were building with blocks in my living room, is Mommy coming back? Miles glanced at me before answering. No, buddy, Mommy is going to live somewhere else now, but she'll still see you sometimes. Will the new baby live with us? No, the baby is going to live with its daddy. Tommy considered this for a moment, then shrugged and went back to his blocks. Children have a remarkable ability to adapt when they feel secure and loved. The social fallout for Ophelia was swift and severe. Word of what had happened at the birthday party spread through their social circle like wildfire. The couple who had been invited to every important event, who had been considered relationship goals by their friends, suddenly found themselves completely ostracized. Miles told me that several of their mutual friends had reached out to him privately, admitting they had never liked Ophelia, but hadn't felt comfortable saying anything. Sarah said she always thought Ophelia was fake, Miles reported, after running into one of their former couple friends at the grocery store. She said Ophelia would make cutting remarks about other people when they weren't around, but always with a smile, so it seemed like she was just being honest. And you never noticed this? I noticed, but I told myself she was just discerning, that she had high standards. He shook his head. I made excuses for behavior I knew was wrong because I was so grateful that someone like her had chosen someone like me. That insight broke my heart. My confident, capable son had been so undermined by Ophelia's subtle criticisms that he had genuinely believed he was lucky to be with someone who treated him poorly. The business connections that Ophelia had dangled as bait for her long-term manipulation scheme evaporated as well. Her father, embarrassed by his daughter's public scandal, quietly withdrew the job offers and partnership opportunities he had been discussing with Miles. It's probably for the best, Miles told me. I never really wanted to work in that industry anyway. Ophelia was the one pushing for it. What do you want to do? I don't know. For the first time in 3 years, I get to decide what I want without checking with someone else first. The freedom seemed to both exhilarate and terrify him. Meanwhile, Ophelia's attempts to salvage her reputation grew increasingly desperate. She tried calling Miles repeatedly, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. When he blocked her number, she started showing up at his workplace. She cornered me in the parking lot yesterday, he told me during one of our conversations. She was crying, saying the stress of the divorce was affecting the baby, begging me to take her back. What did you tell her? That the baby wasn't my responsibility, and neither was she. It was a harsh truth, but a necessary one. Ophelia had made her choices, and the consequences belonged to her alone. The most pathetic incident came when she tried to ambush me at the grocery store where I shopped every Tuesday morning. I was comparing prices on coffee when I heard her voice behind me. Janine, please. I need to talk to you. I turned to find her looking haggard and desperate. Her usual perfect appearance had deteriorated noticeably. Her roots were showing, her clothes looked slept in, and her face was puffy from crying. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," I said calmly, continuing with my shopping. "You don't understand. I've lost everything. My marriage, my home, my friends. David won't even speak to me about the baby except through lawyers. And whose fault is that? I made mistakes, yes, but everyone deserves forgiveness. Everyone deserves a second chance." I stopped walking and looked at her directly. "You didn't make mistakes, Ophelia. You made choices. Calculated, deliberate choices to deceive everyone who cared about you. I was confused. I was unhappy. I didn't know what I wanted. You knew exactly what you wanted. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. You wanted the security of marriage to Miles and the excitement of an affair with David, and you were willing to lie to both of them to keep it." Her face crumpled. "I'm pregnant and alone. Doesn't that matter to you at all? You're pregnant with another man's baby, a man you lied to about being available. You're alone because you chose deception over honesty with everyone in your life. These aren't things that happen to you, Ophelia. These are the natural consequences of your actions." "You're heartless," she whispered. "No," I replied. "I'm just done pretending that your poor choices are anyone else's responsibility." I walked away from her that day, and I never saw her again. Miles told me later that she had moved back to her hometown to live with her parents until the baby was born. David was pursuing custody arrangements through his lawyer, but wanted no personal contact with her. She had gotten exactly what she had planned for months. She was finally free of her marriage to Miles. But she had lost everything else in the process: her lover, her social status, her financial security, and the respect of everyone who knew her. As I watched my son slowly rebuild his confidence and his relationship with his child, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet contentment that comes from seeing truth prevail over deception. Justice, I realized, didn't always require punishment. Sometimes it was simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their choices without interference or protection from those consequences. Ophelia had built her life on lies, and when those lies finally collapsed, the life built on them collapsed too. That wasn't my doing. That was just the inevitable result of trying to build something real on a foundation of deception. Miles was finally free to discover who he really was, without someone telling him he needed to be different. Tommy had his father back, fully present and engaged instead of constantly walking on eggshells around an unpredictable partner. And I had my family back, not through manipulation or force, but because the truth had finally been allowed to shine light into the darkness that had consumed us all. 8 months later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Sunday dinner while Tommy sat at my table working on a puzzle. The autumn light streaming through my windows was warm and golden, and the apartment that had felt so empty for years was now filled with the sounds of family life again. "Grandma Janine, I can't find the corner piece," Tommy called out, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Keep looking, sweetheart. It's probably hiding in plain sight." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the most important things are right in front of us, but we're too distracted to see them clearly. Miles arrived promptly at 5 o'clock, as had become our tradition. He looked healthier than he had in years. The constant tension that had marked his face during his marriage was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen since he was a teenager: genuine contentment. "How was your week?" I asked as he helped me set the table. "Good. Really good, actually. I got the promotion at work. The one you interviewed for last month? That's the one. Apparently my boss was impressed by my newfound confidence and decision-making abilities." He smiled ruefully. "Funny how much easier it is to make decisions when you're not second-guessing yourself constantly." Over dinner, we fell into our comfortable routine of sharing the week's events. Tommy chattered about kindergarten. Miles talked about work, and I told them about my volunteer work at the local library's literacy program. "Mrs. Henderson finished reading her first complete book yesterday," I reported. "She's 73 years old and never learned to read properly as a child." When she read the last page out loud, she started crying. "That's beautiful, Mom," Miles said. "I'm proud of you for doing that." The simple statement of pride hit me harder than I expected. For 3 years, I had felt invisible, unnecessary, like my life experiences and wisdom had no value. Now I was discovering new ways to matter, new ways to contribute. After dinner, while Tommy played with his toys in the living room, Miles and I cleaned up together. It was during these quiet moments that we often had our most important conversations. "I heard from my lawyer today," he said as he dried dishes. "The divorce is officially final. How do you feel about that? Relieved? Free? Like I can finally close that chapter and move forward? And Ophelia? Still living with her parents. David has partial custody of the baby now, a little girl. He sends me pictures sometimes." Miles paused, considering his words. "I feel sorry for that child. She didn't ask to be born into such a complicated situation." "Children are resilient when they're loved," I said. "David seems like a good man who was just as deceived as you were." "He is. We've actually talked a few times. He wanted to apologize for his part in everything, even though he didn't know he was part of an affair." It said something about both men's character that they had been able to find common ground as fellow victims of Ophelia's manipulation rather than enemies competing for her attention. "There's something else," Miles said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I've been thinking about making some changes." "What kind of changes?" "I want to move closer to you. Tommy spends so much time here anyway, and I realized I don't want him growing up the way I did after Dad died, feeling like he only has one parent." The suggestion took my breath away. "You don't have to do that for me, Miles. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for all of us. I want Tommy to grow up knowing his grandmother, really knowing her. I want him to have the kind of family support I pushed away because I was too proud and too foolish to see its value." "And what about your life? Your independence?" Miles laughed, but it was a warm sound, not bitter. "What independence? For 3 years, I was afraid to make any major decision without checking with Ophelia first. Now, I want to make decisions based on what's actually important to me. And what's important to you? Family. Real family. The kind that supports each other instead of tearing each other down." Later that evening, after Miles and Tommy had gone home, I sat in my favorite chair reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed. The woman who had felt invisible and disposable 8 months ago now had a full calendar and a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. It was from Ophelia's hometown. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello? Is this Janine Whitmore?" The voice was unfamiliar, older, with a slight southern accent. "Yes, this is Janine. My name is Margaret Crawford. I'm Ophelia's mother." My grip tightened on the phone. "Mrs. Crawford, what can I do for you?" There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I wanted to call and apologize for my daughter's behavior. I know what she did to your family was unforgivable. The last thing I had expected was an apology from Ophelia's mother." "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kind, it's necessary. Robert and I raised that girl to be better than what she became. We're ashamed of the choices she made and the people she hurt." I could hear the genuine pain in her voice. Whatever else Ophelia was, she was still this woman's daughter, and watching your child destroy their life through their own poor choices had to be devastating. "How is she doing?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "She's struggling. The baby is beautiful, little Sarah, but Ophelia is having a hard time adjusting to single motherhood. David is a good father when he has visitation, but he wants nothing to do with Ophelia personally. That's probably for the best." "Yes, it is. She keeps talking about trying to win Miles back, about how she could be a better wife if he'd just give her another chance. I keep telling her that ship has sailed, but she doesn't want to hear it. Miles has moved on completely. He's a different person now, happier, more confident. He's not the same man she married. Good for him. He deserves better than what my daughter gave him." Margaret paused again. "I also wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For stopping her before she could do even more damage. For forcing the truth into the light. If you hadn't intervened, she might have continued that deception for years. More people would have been hurt." The gratitude in her voice was unexpected and moving. I just wanted to protect my family. You did more than that. You probably saved my daughter from making even worse choices down the road. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment thinking about that conversation. Ophelia's own mother understood what Ophelia herself still refused to acknowledge, that facing consequences was the only way she might eventually learn to make better choices. The next morning brought another surprise. Miles called while I was having my coffee. "Mom, I have news. Big news. Good news or concerning news?" "Definitely good news. I found a house." "A house?" 3 blocks from your apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small yard for Tommy, and a front porch where you can sit and watch him play. I put in an offer this morning." The image he painted made my heart swell. "Miles, are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I spent 3 years living in someone else's idea of the perfect life. Now I want to build something real." The house purchase went through quickly. Miles sold his old house, too many bad memories, he said, and moved into the small bungalow just a few streets away from me. Tommy was thrilled to be so close to his grandmother, and I found myself with a purpose I hadn't had since Miles was young. I became the reliable babysitter when Miles worked late, the homework helper when Tommy started having trouble with math, the cookie baker for school events, and the storyteller for bedtime when Miles was too tired to read. But more than that, I became a witness to my son's transformation. Without Ophelia's constant criticism and manipulation, Miles blossomed into the man I had always known he could be. He started coaching Tommy's Little League team, volunteered at the local food bank, and even began dating again. But slowly, carefully, with the wisdom that comes from having survived a relationship built on deception. 1 year after that disastrous birthday party, Tommy was turning 6. This time, the celebration was simple, just family and a few close friends in our neighborhood park. No expensive decorations, no hired entertainment, no social media photo opportunities. Just children playing, adults talking and laughing, and birthday cake that I had made myself in my own kitchen. As I watched Tommy run around with his friends, clutching a new wooden truck I had carved for him with help from a woodworking class I'd started taking, I marveled at how much had changed. Miles approached me as I was cleaning up paper plates, slipping his arm around my shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For fighting for us when I was too blind to fight for myself. For loving me enough to risk everything to save our family. That's what mothers do," I replied. "We protect our children, even when they're grown, even when they don't want our protection. I know that now, and I promise you, I will never take it for granted again." As the sun set on that perfect day, I realized that my story wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about the enduring power of genuine love over manufactured affection, of truth over deception, of family bonds that can be damaged but never completely broken. Ophelia had tried to erase me from my son's life, but she had underestimated something fundamental. Real love doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. It might be pushed aside, ignored, or taken for granted, but it endures. I had won my family back not through manipulation or force, but by refusing to give up on the truth. And in the end, that truth had set us all free. Free from lies, free from toxic relationships, and free to build something authentic and lasting. Standing in that park, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of genuine family love, I knew that this was exactly where I belonged, not as an unwelcome intruder in someone else's perfect life, but as the beloved matriarch of a family that chose truth over convenience, love over status, and each other over everything else. For the first time in years, I was completely, genuinely, joyfully home. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.